Only mode.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by InspireOne. We'd like to thank you all for attending this session and hope that you find it relevant. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some quick logistical items. Since this is a listen-only webinar, please feel free to type your questions in the chat area, and we'll do our best to address all the questions toward the end of it. In case you drop out or have to leave for any reason, you can view a recorded version which would be shared with you as a follow-up email. In case you'd like a copy of this presentation, please write to us at info@inspireone.in. That is info@inspireone.in, and we'll be happy to email it to you or send you a link from where you can download the deck. In today's webinar, we are extremely happy to include our China partner Learning Gym to discuss and showcase the state of mobile learning in China and how it contrasts with India. Learning Gym is a leading digital and blended learning solutions provider in the Great China area, having recently won many awards including the Best Mobile Learning Vendor in 2019. Our key speakers today are Edmund Lai and Karthik Mohla. Edmund is the Vice President of Sales and Project at Learning Gym. Edmund has learned and developed some best practices of mobile learning from all over the globe, some of which he will share in the webinar today. Edmund is joined by Karthik Mohla, founder and CEO at InspireOne Technologies. Over to Karthik now to get started with today's session.
Thank you very much, Anandi, and welcome again to everybody for this webinar. A big welcome again to you, Edmund, from Shanghai. I thank you very much for having us or being available in today's webinar. And I think why don't we get started with what we have on the agenda so far. Great. So if you see today's focus, we're really trying to get a little bit deeper into the state of mobile learning, both here in India and also how does it compare with our neighbor China. I think just given the logistics, given the location, given the demographics, there's a lot to learn from and also a lot that we can find as commonalities and parts of variation with China. And I'm very happy to have Edmund give us some perspective from his experience on how does mobile learning work and what are the dynamics that companies have to navigate when they build a successful mobile learning initiative. So on the agenda today, I thought it would be good to just take a step back to talk about in mobile learning, what does it mean to be mobile first truly? And I'll ask Edmund to share his perspectives on that as well. And with that, we'll then dive head on into understanding vis-a-vis India, how does the economy and how does the industry of mobile learning compare in China? What are some of the best practices that companies are doing in adopting a mobile-first mobile learning approach? In the experience that we've had, both in India and China, we'll also talk about what are certain risks and pitfalls that companies need to be wary of, and what are the ways and strategies you can use to cope with those potential risks. And ultimately, we'd obviously want to conclude with some perspective and insights of how companies have also tied mobile learning to business impact. Now, this could be impact in terms of sales, it could be in terms of employee attrition, addressing other aspects of engagement as well. So we'll try to give a more holistic view of how mobile learning ties to business impact and what have companies here in India as well as in China been able to successfully achieve. So over to the next section then. One of the things that we've seen organizations grapple when they talk about mobile learning is trying to figure out what is the first step they need to take, even from a thought perspective. And here it's interesting to understand that mobile learning, while in some ways is very similar to online learning, but it also takes a significant departure from your traditional LMS-based e-learning principles. So for one, it's not the same as just trying to resize content from a desktop or a laptop, which has a higher form factor to a simple mobile device. I think that is one of the first intuitive thoughts that most companies think about when they think mobile learning. And while that is still a very important perspective to have, there is a lot more that you stand to lose out by not leveraging the inherent advantage of mobile if you restrict mobile learning to only resizing content. And Edmund and I are going to talk about that in the subsequent slides. The other important aspect, which is related to the first point, is there are also many other disciplines and approaches that you can use with mobile learning when you think mobile first. Now, those approaches may not necessarily be available when you look at online learning or your traditional e-learning. So what are those disciplines and how can we leverage them in whatever content you're looking at imparting the learning for? That's an important thought perspective to have. And some of the disciplines that we've seen work very well here in India and also in China are game designs, are behavioral psychology, and also looking at data from a different lens. The other thing which is equally important is to think beyond having a responsive experience. And by responsive, I mean just not restricting the thought of mobile learning to say, how does the content and experience scale from a mobile to a desktop and vice versa? I think more important is to think of, when you're thinking mobile, how do you think scale? How do you think of information dissemination at an instant? How do you think about having the right kind of content which is contextual for the learner? And ultimately, how do you think about making sure that that content is building some repetitive tasks, building certain habits, which is ultimately going to lead to a change of behavior, and through that behavior change, result in business impact. So with that, I'm going to ask Edmund if he has any perspectives that he'd like to share when it comes to mobile first and mobile learning in China. Edmund, how do you see the Chinese companies when they think of mobile first? What is the approach they've been using so far?
For most of the approach, Kazak, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to join this special webinar and share the view on how things are happening in China. To answer your questions, is many corporate in China has been well introduced on the mobile learning, or probably back into 2013, with the smartphones, with the internet, fast growing in our industries. For the very similar part that with India is that we have large group of employee spread around in all different regions, and in order to help to spread the know-how or the information that required to every individuals, mobile has become a very handicapped equipment for us to do so. So when it comes to training, when it's come to transferring all the know-how, that's the first thing that we've come to mind. But because we had lack of experience in doing so, we were taking baby steps. But until only for the past couple of years, mobile learning has become more and more mature now. So in the next couple of slides, I'll probably talk a little bit more on how the industry in that sense has grown.
Brilliant. That sounds like a good plan. And I think on that point of maturing, one of the things we're also seeing companies finally understand and also build a lot of thought process around is, what does mobile learning and mobile first also mean for different stakeholders? So intuitively, again, I think it's very easy to think only and exclusively for the end learner and how his or her experience is going to be maximized as part of any business objective that a company wants to achieve. But beyond the learner, two very important stakeholders that now organizations are empathizing with more and more are, one, the content creators or the trainers themselves. Because what I think we've all learned from the experience with e-learning and LMS-led learning is that the human involvement of learning is still going to be critical and will eventually trump any form of online learning, especially when it comes to certain learning outcomes. Think very highly nuanced behavioral training, for example, right? And that's where I think it's important for companies to realize, what does a mobile first approach, and hence what does a mobile learning initiative have to do with the trainer and the content creator? What is the value proposition that we can impart for them? And then the third stakeholder, which ultimately is going to lead to a higher level of engagement and also result in business impact, is the line manager. Now, traditionally, in most sales-driven organizations, in most customer service-driven organizations, most managers ultimately care about business. They care about business numbers because that's what they have to also ultimately report the higher up in the hierarchy. And to ensure that there is some business value, we have to tie in a mobile first approach also from the perspective of the manager, and be very clear from the beginning itself of how does that data ultimately tie to numbers that the manager can review in his or her daily huddles, in his or her weekly or quarterly reviews as well. So I think the building blocks of mobile learning, essentially whether it's India or China, I think these are fairly universal points. They have to have a three-pronged approach where you're looking at the end learner for sure, but that's also being substantiated with what is the value proposition for the line manager and the content creator or the trainer. You can also argue that a fourth stakeholder, which is the project sponsor, ultimately also has to have an eagle's eye view on how the entire initiative is going to transpire. And I think that's an important element that is also worth mentioning over here. But I think what we'd like to just summarize in this slide is one very important commonality for mobile learning, irrespective of country or geography, is having a holistic approach which encompasses different stakeholders. So with that, Edmund, I'd like you to just share a little bit about what has the experience in China taught you and Learning Gym about the various steps of mobile learning that are currently playing out. And also if you can talk about, like you mentioned, as companies mature in their usage of mobile learning, what are some of the next practices you see coming out of China and Chinese companies?
Hello.
Yes, Edmund, I'll just repeat. Yeah, can you hear us?
Hello, Kadik. Yes, sorry, I think that can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Edmund.
Yes.
Carry on.
Sorry. Yes. I was just about to say that, as I was saying in a couple of slides before, China has grown dramatically on the mobile learning, the scale of it. And by what you were saying, that there's three different stakeholders that are really concerning on how that things would go. But first of all, it's very often that we would approach, once the organizations would like to take up the mobile learning approach, the first that would always come to us is either the marketing director or the HR resource director, because it's equivalent to whatever content that they're using. For those people, very often that they come to us with 6 stages. We've summarized them. The first stage that they come to us with real excitement, saying that, hey, Edmund, we would like to do this and do that. I heard that Learning Gym have done this very well. So what sort of advice, what sort of approach that we should be taking? And then we start talking to them in more detail, and I've told them the complexity of how a mobile learning works. Then they start to get a little bit confused. They thought it was quite an easy task, saying, I'll just get everything online, spread all the knowledge onto our mobile and just press the button and everything should be done automatically. But that wasn't the case. So they started to feel, oh my God, this is such a huge job that I need to do. They starting to feel such a chaos, and they might not even want to do it. But then after that stage, that we would start to tell them there's actually a different stage that we can take into considerations. The first stage that I will be talking, it will be in the after couple of slides. When I've gone through the stages with them, the key contents, the key provider would start to think, all right, okay, I feel a little bit organized right now. I know what to do for step 1, step 2, and step 3. And once they get their head clear and manage to get all the resources internally, then they will start to feel, all right, great, I have my orderly now. Now I know what I should be taking the right approach. And once after that stage has gone, they will immediately feel excited because the achievement that they will gain in the end will be very high. As a result of that, that's why in the end of at the right side of the slide, I've said there's no end to mobile learnings. With all the applications that we've been using right now, if you recall to applications 1.0 to what we have now on others 3.0, it's completely different. So we just need to take time for our applications to evolve at that stage. So since there's no end to mobile learning, so what should we do at the very first stage? First of all, to establish a plan within your budget. Don't overestimate the complexity of how a mobile learning would work in this case. You need to tie it up with your budget plan. And secondly, you need to choose the most relevant platform for your own company. Having said that, what do I mean by that? That you need to learn what sort of functionality that you will require for your specific needs. That's the point that where people are confused. You might be a little bit confused as well, but on the next couple of slides that I would be talking, you will start to know, all right, that's the first thing that I need to choose. And that's the second thing that I need to start designing. And that's the third thing that we need to do. That will be coming in the next couple of slides. And for the last tips that I'll go, take everything easy. Don't do everything as so complicated in terms with the content. There's like, as I was saying that on the third tips is the content and the activity 1.0. What do I mean by that? Is as easy as having yourself to make your content upload to the mobile learning. Don't need to have anything too fancy of saying that I need to make animations, everything, gamifications. That's not necessary at the very first stage. Just keep everything simple in the very beginning. Then you will be able to get your right feet off. So for the next slide, Kartik, if you help me to change to the next slide.
Yep.
A lot of people have asked me these questions locally or internationally with our partners. Obviously, everyone knows that why do we need to do mobile learning? But what's the true reason behind of it? A lot of our clients, the first pop-up is the fashions. It's because the fast-growing industry. Everyone is doing else. I need to do it as well. Otherwise, I'll be looked down. I'll be looking at as a low-tech company. With no face, that sort of things. But in fact, I've told them it's not that the case. Is because the key learning behavior within organizations, within the learners, within the younger generations has changed dramatically. Imagining now of the Z generations, the X generations, the new generations, what they are thinking is, I don't want to sit around in a classroom for a whole day or 2 days to just listen to a trainer talking to me, going through all the topics. What I want to do is everything in bite size. Whenever I'm free, I would do the learning myself. And once I've took that bite of learning, I'll try to transform it into learning behavior. That's the new way of learning right now. And that is happening very fast in China, even with our primary school, even with our younger students that going into kindergarten. Instead of going to a full day's learning sessions, they're doing bite-sized learning as well. And they have applications that they will do at home. They don't do like 8 hours full days learning anymore now. The reason is because the key learning behavior has changed of that. Because of this reason, on the next slide, I will also tell you that when we are doing on mobile learning, which are the most correct target group that we should be focusing into. Kartik, can you please turn to the next slide of the target group, please?
Yeah, absolutely, Edmund. I just had a quick question, if I can just ask over here. So, a couple of things that you've said, I just wanted to, build a parallel with. I think in the earlier slide where you talked about the 6 stages that you're seeing clients have, it's very similar to, what Gartner calls the hype cycle for any new technology. right? So at the time of innovation, there's this inflated expectation of what can come, and then there's usually what they call a trough of disillusionment. People get a little confused, like you said, and there's also chaos. And ultimately, once productivity starts ramping up, people become a little bit more content and ultimately happy with what they're using. The other thing that you've also mentioned is that a lot of companies in China seem to initially start thinking of mobile learning because it sounds fashionable. I just thought I'll build a parallel here in India as well, that while that is also somewhat the case over here in India, one very interesting trend that is as recent as the last quarter, Edmund, is that while overall growth in volume of mobile phones had actually degrown in India, the growth in premium smartphones in the April to June quarter had actually increased by 33%. So as you see, more people are willing to actually do away more of their disposable income to buy, the next high category phone. One of the things that companies are also then trying to leverage as a result of that is to say, how can we make better use of mobile, because people are happy to do away with their money and get the next best phone. I just had a question. How does this work in China? You mentioned that in China, even at the K-12 level, people are looking at mobile learning. But beyond the fashion, is the investment from the learner also very high in terms of wanting to have the best phone, and also then ensuring that the learning experience is as good as, let's say, any other app that they use?
Yes, that's a very, very much similar case in China as well, what you just mentioned. The smartphone purchasing is high. People are, as you was, I say that the learning journey that they're seeking is more premiums. What they want is to, I would quote saying that I want to have fun during learning. And with the mobile phones, learning experience, with all the gamifications, with all the different type of learning methodologies, that has increased the interest of learners as well. So that's why it has brought us very we require our professional opinions of saying that how to make this content fulfillment enough for our learners to use as well. So that is also the case. People looking for a more mature excitement type of device. They are looking for more comfortable learning experience as well. So that's the case, yes. And for this particular slide that I was talking about is what are the really target group that we should be focusing in. There's no 100% participant rate on the mobile learning. Why would I say that? Is when we're doing an offline training, for instance, we have 30 people in the classrooms, attention rate for the whole day program would be 100%. But for mobile learning, that would never be the case, unless the topic is super interesting, like the new Apple presentations with the new product launch. Maybe that sort of a participant rate would be high. But for on all general learnings, mobile learning that we have done previously, the more proactive, the more self-learning willingness to come to the platform learning is 80%, the maximums. Why do I say that? Is if I divide into a company of 20%, 60%, 20%, 20% of the people would be of the top notch of the company. They would do the learning themselves. You don't need to drive them to do anything else. Whereas the 60%, they are come and goes type of people. If they see the needs of it, they will go ahead and study it and go ahead and learn it. And if they were told to go ahead to do it, then they will also do it as well. But whereas the bottom 20%, they sort of have a mentality of rejecting this sort of training. They do not want to engage with us. They're not willing to share, or they don't even want. Sometimes they don't even register for the application. This happens, and I want to tell everyone it's normal when this come across. So there's no need to worry that why don't I get a 100% participant rate? why are not 100% of our employees studying these programs? This is absolutely normal. So what we will need to do is, in the end of how we are bringing the knowledge across, are these concepts that we're designing for them are useful for them, or they already know it already? There's a specific data analysis that we need to do after each mobile learning that we have launched to our learners. So this is the particular slide that I want to tell you. There's no 100% perfect score on the mobile learning, and please do not look for it as well, because it's going to be very difficult. But I mean, for our, if we understand this point of view, then there's not such of a chaos will be happening in the next coming times.
Right, right. Which is interesting to also contrast with India. So what, at least over here with our limited experience, we've seen, Edmund, is that the distribution of learners follows a very similar pattern that you are describing, wherein you have a certain small percentage of learners who are self-driven. From our data, we are seeing perhaps not as high as 20%, but not very far off at 15% learners being able to drive learning on mobile on their own. The balance 60% that you are talking about, which in India possibly is more at the 70% mark, is where I think the same dynamics are following through as well. And I think what I was keen to understand from your experience is, what is the typical length of any mobile learning content that you're seeing Chinese companies adopt? On average, we've seen e-learning, let's say, take anywhere between 60 to 90 minutes. What is your experience for mobile learning in China? How long is the duration of a course?
Previously, most of the clients are looking at, as you're saying, that in the e-learning sectors, but most of it will probably take about 90 minutes. But for the past couple of years, that length of learning time has dropped dramatically. For our clients, they are looking for maximum 15 minutes. But what they're really looking for is 3 to 5 minutes of learning clips. So that's about the learning time, the attention time they are getting at the moment in China.
Right.
So the behavior has changed dramatically as well.
Right, and perhaps you could also spend some time to talk about, you've mentioned that there are 3 strong pillars of how you need to structure mobile learning. This slide gives some perspective on that. If you can give some more details to us on how do Chinese companies and how does the ecosystem of mobile learning in China look like, I think that would be really helpful to also contrast.
Yes, I think this slide will probably explain why the 6 stages of mobile learning happens in China. As you were saying, as I was saying, that people feel excited and coming to me saying, "Hey, Edmund, I want to start a mobile learning," but they soon to get confused, because they will start to, the first thing that they will look into is a service provider that will provide them with platform. And they thought all platform providers are the same, but in reality isn't. I'm sure in India, there are many platform providers as well. In China, there's over 1,000 platform providers, but with for the past couple of years, the industries beating out with each other's. Probably now they're in like top 10 platform providers in China, top-notch platform provider that top Fortune 500 company would choose on using them. Because the confusions of clients would be saying that, okay, what sort of functionality that I would like? Because as you can see on the slide on the left one, the platform on the mobiles, that you see there's like different service provider providing the applications that we could use online. Each of them has specific different areas. Some might be focusing on the training logistics. Some might be focusing on the e-learning experience. Some are focusing on the gamifications, or some would be having a whole holistic approach of, I can place the content onto it, I can play with examinations, I have gamifications. But that is a very complicated decisions for clients to make, because that would, in terms of investment, that would take up some some revenue off them as well. So that's the first thing that our client will come across, choosing the right platform providers. Once they have chosen the right platform provider, the second things that they were starting to look into is the content. Well, I have a platform now, but I need to insert content for our employees in order to learn. There are three types of materials, content-wise, that they will need to insert for. The first one is actually the standardized off-the-shelf programs that they would purchase from different service providers all around the world, that they can purchase in terms with the leaderships, management, sales, soft skills, any type of off-the-shelf programs that you can search online. And the second one is bespoke. They probably will ask a specific service provider would tailor-make all the soft skills, all the know-how for them, specifically for their industry, specifically for their company. But that would take a little bit longer time for them to develop, as a service provider would need to go in depth of understanding the business model, what would be the case study like, that sort of things. And some of the clients would like it into animations, or sometimes they would like a real life performance, case scenario recorded on right scenes, that sort of things. On the third and the most popular ones that are starting to arise is actually self-made by the first couple of slides that you've shown, the internal trainers. They're using PowerPoint, audio features. They just created the program on their own, and they'll in place these contents onto the platform and for the learners to learn. So once the clients have completed searching for the right contents, they thought would be easy, because they thought, all right, I'll just push the push button and send all the relevant contents to our learners, and people started to learn. But funny how that's not the case. Very often the participant rate or completion rate is rather low. That's the reason why I've placed the third very essential elements that when you come to mobile learning, what sort of structures that you need to look into is the operations. What do I mean by the operation? Is to create the correct learning journey for the learners. For what I'm saying is, if you're trying to create sales online training projects, you can't just send 7 programs with the opening, probing questions, answering objections, features, advantage, benefit, that sort of program to them. What we need to create is a learning journey of saying that why do you need to learn it, what sort of benefit, what will be coming up next, what sort of follow-up, what sort of coaching that we're providing to you, what sort of assignment that you'll be getting, would there be any examinations, or after completion of the programs, what sort of certifications that you'll be getting from us. That sort of thing is the holistic approach for them on learning, for the learning journeys. So once a very mature clients understand these 3 approach, then they would be able to say, all right, okay, I understand. I need to find the right platform provider. I need to have the right content, and also I need to design the right learning journey for the learners that I have. So all the clients in China are searching for these 3 different service providers.
That's really interesting, Edmund. I think it's helpful to get some color on each of these 3 important building blocks for creating a holistic mobile learning journey. I had a follow-up question to this. In China, are you seeing one on the company's side, companies very methodological in first choosing a platform, then going after content, and then figuring out what the learning journey needs to be? Or are you also seeing companies take a more holistic approach, which is to say, how do I look at all these 3 things joined up together from the beginning itself, rather than sequentially buying first the platform, then the content? What is your experience? How do Chinese companies navigate that?
Initially, they were taking into sequence of saying that, I will need to choose the right platform and then to insert for the right content and then build the learning journey. But as now our clients are more educated and they understand the approach of these 3 very essential elements, What they are doing now, they are in search of a company similar to Learning Gym and us and InspireOne, I believe so as well, that could provide all services to them as well as a one-stop approach, because they find it rather difficult to saying that I've selected this platform on A service provider and I'm using B, C service provider, and then I'm using D service provider for these, and it makes communications, it makes other things complicated as well. So in that sense, to answer your questions, initially they were in search of separate ones, but now they are searching for one service provider that could provide all the approach.
Right, right. So in other words, there's a rise in what you can also call as mobile learning OEMs, similar to how in automobiles you have the likes of Toyotas, the General Motors of the world, wherein you're actually getting an end car, right? Rather than buying an engine separately, the chassis separately, etc. And yes, what you're saying is in China, the market is also evolving to say, how can we look at a holistic initiative where you're building and joining the content with the platform and creating the learning journey all at the same time, rather than doing it in a disjointed manner?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, all right. Which I think leads us to the next section, where we'd like to talk a little bit about, from the experience that you've seen in China and with some companies that we've also done work with, what are certain best practices when people think of mobile learning and when they also think of mobile first? So I'll probably just walk through a few of these examples, and would be great to get your perspective as well, Edmund. I think the first thing that that we are seeing, and it may tie well to what you also said, which was to start simple. I will probably just add saying start simple and also let's stay focused. So what we've seen working really well is, rather than offering a bouquet of many courses to learners on mobile, because that could also still have a simple experience, the challenge with that would be that it may not be very focused. And to what Edmund's point of creating a specific learning journey was, is that if there is a specific business objective that clients want to address, so let's say it could be on improving sales productivity, or it could be about how do you get a consistent customer experience across, let's say, all the banks, all the branches of your bank. Those are specific objectives that will be better suited to start with and to create a learning journey as a result of, rather than trying to create a whole host of content which you may already have on e-learning, and you're just simply porting that to mobile so that a learner can have 50 or even 100 or even more than 100 courses to choose from. The challenge with that is, we've seen from experience, and like what Edmund was saying, that learners get confused with what they need to do first. So sometimes giving choices is not really the best option. Having a focused series of learning events take place with a very clear communication and a very clear line of sight to business impact usually is a good practice to follow. The second thing that we've also seen, and I think this ties back again to the mobile first point of view, is when you're thinking mobile learning, reimagine the learning experience. Let's not take the same paradigms of what worked well in the classroom and certainly what worked well in e-learning to be the only limiting factors when you think of mobile learning. So for everyone's benefit, we've created a very simple acronym called EASE, which essentially stands for engaging, addictive, simple, and effective. And essentially, if you go around, just these 4 simple keywords and tenets, they would be your guiding principles to think of how you can reimagine the learning experience. So this is one important perspective also to have, which is to not be limited to looking at what has worked on other mediums of learning. Treat mobile learning on its own merit, and let's not only look at transferring what is simply there on the LMS and putting it out there on mobile, because we've seen from experience that is, one, not the simplest approach. It's certainly not the most addictive or effective, and it also has limits to how much of engagement you can actually make. The third thing, which I think Edmund has also spoken about, so I'm not going to spend too much time, is again not to disjointedly focus on platform first or content later, or even the other way around. Both of them are, in the mobile world, inextricably linked, and the more linked, more intertwined you can make this relationship for your company, the more engaging and the more addictive, and also the more effective will be the learning experience for your organization. Edmund, why don't you talk a little bit about in China this O2O learning motion that you have set in place, and how does this work well when it comes to not just launching a mobile initiative, but also then how do you sustain it for a longer period of time?
Yes, and for this specific model, we have been using it for the past 3 years, and it has worked very well with all the organizations. Reason being is because this is the right approach for introducing the mobile learning to the learners, or even launching a new programs. If I want to make this, I think I'll give an example of saying that if there's a new employees, a group of new employees that we need to train, in China, sometimes we probably have 100 new employees within a quarters, and the company are looking to train them up very quickly. So what we need to do is we will have to understand what sort of new employees required. So what we would do on the first approach is to promote. What do I mean by that is we need to promote our company, the core values, what you'll be facing in the futures, what sort of applications that you'll be using, what sort of material that we're providing to you, what are the benefits of using the mobile learning. So we need to attract, we need to facilitate and to maneuver all the learners' interest in using the mobile app. It gives them an ease of mind saying that this is not going to be a difficult thing. All I need to do is just log onto my applications and I got everything that I need. And for that promotion, after that, is the learning side. What do I mean by learning is once I promote all the materials, then I need to have the right content. That, as I was saying that on the previous slide, they said that I need to design the right content, feed them on saying that for being a new employee, what is our company core values, what our missions, visions, what is your role and responsibility is going to be like, and what is the skill set that is required. So on this learning journey that they might have if as little as 10 little programs or as much as 20 or 30 programs within a month's time for them to learn. Each probably consists only 5 to 10 minutes times for them to grasp throughout the 30 days of new employee orientations. But as I'm saying, that isn't just enough of just throwing contents for them to learn. Well, we need to have a lot of, sometimes not necessarily online, have offline activities designed for them as well. As I was saying, as you, Kata, you were saying that, I don't think there is a huge contrast or differentiations with the online and offline. I think they exist, both coexist in the training world, and they just use at a different tools to facilitate what we need to bring across to our learners. So at this point, the activities that we could design something gamifications online to test them, similar to Master-O that InspireOne provide, to make sure that they understand all the content they have learned. And sometimes we will select the best performers, or sometimes we would do something offline. Maybe we'll run an offline workshop with frequent asked questions, and then we'll invite the CEO of the company to have a half an hour Q&A sections to answer all the questions that they might have, you know, to get their attention of saying that, you know, they are truly being valued by the company, that sort of things. So there's many ways of activity that we could create. But what we want to do during the activity is really to engage all the learners, to share, to comment, and even to co-create further ideas for the next coming sessions. But after that, after the sharing, after the comments, what we need to do is we need to summarize all these and to show them, because as I was saying that I've made an example of 100 new employees coming into this mobile learning activities. But I need to summarize these and showcase back to everyone what would be the best practice out of this, what would be the best way of introducing ourselves within the company, how do I get my feet on so that I won't be so nervous as my first day in working as well. So this is a complete loop of designing a learning journey on this sense. So this learning motion has worked very well. After that, we have told our clients how to create a learning journey. So this is the motions that we need to look. And on the bottom of the slide I've placed into is the platform maintenance. It's very essential for us to understand that we need to know what sort of personnel information, what are the organizational structures, the learning results, activity records, and the training course data as well. These are the raw data that we need to use to analyze for our next stage of approach. If this like the first stage of 100 new employee, and for next quarters, do I need to, once I've analyzed the data, do I need to adjust any of the learning journeys? Because these are popular, these are not popular. So what sort of things that we need to make adjustment? These are from the platform maintenance that we need to analyze the raw data. So Kazak, if you can go to the next slide, and then you will be able to see these four simple steps actually works in a full motions in order to run a whole project for different companies. Kazak, can you show to the next slide? Hello? Hello?
Yeah, Edmund, is this the slide you were referring to? I think after this.
Yes, I'm still on the operation idea. It should be slide 17.
Do you want to just talk about it on in context to this slide if it's relevant over here?
Yes, because my screen is not on that side, but I was saying that this approach works as a very little mechanics, that if one drop off, then the whole learning journey might fall as well. So we need to specifically design on how well on our learning journey for our learners. Yes, I got this one now.
Right. Right. I think this also ties very well to the earlier slide that you had showcased, where learners could effectively be broken into, let's say, 3 cohorts, right? Let's call the first cohort proactive learners. Let's call the middle cohort reactive learners, where you need to trigger them every now and then. And then the last cohort where you showed in China, there are 20% of learners who are inactive. Regardless of what you do, they are likely to not really take up any new form of learning, including mobile learning. One of the examples I'd like to share over here is with a company in the health insurance space in India. So health insurance of late has seen somewhat of a renaissance, with companies focusing on improving the penetration rate of health insurance. Now the challenge is, with a lot of companies that have a well-distributed sales force, is that the sales people are very well tuned to selling other forms of general insurance, like let's say auto insurance. And hence the challenge for them is about, how do you build confidence in also understanding the nuances of health insurance, and how do you have an intelligent conversation with the client and even with distributors about that. And one company decided that mobile learning would be a great way to build that confidence for its frontline workforce of almost close to 500 frontline sales executives. But what they found is, during the adoption, there was a very clear bifurcation of learners into this kind of a segment, where you had 10-15% of learners who were very proactive and for whom that initiative itself was able to sustain and help them bring confidence. But for a large amount of people, almost close to 60-70%, which is roughly around 350 frontline sales guys, there were different activities that constantly needed to be identified and understood, so as to engage with them and to make sure that, one, they were constantly being nudged, and secondly, as a result of that nudge, people were learning habitually and over a period of time building that confidence that they could then take offline into their conversations with customers. So a few of the activities that the company was co-driving with us was, one, building very, very contextual leaderboards for the managers. So effectively, the managers were pitted against each other in a form of a league table, similar to how in cricket we have the Premier League. And in such a manner, each and every manager was incentivized to ensure that on certain parameters related to learning outcomes, for example, how many questions were the person getting correct versus incorrect, they were then being incentivized and ranked accordingly. Now, what that did was it also allowed the manager to spend a very small but important amount of time during the daily huddle with their team to talk about certain aspects of health insurance which people were reluctant to talk about. For example, what are certain what are certain inclusions that the company was providing to the end customer, and what were certain things that it wasn't providing. So by doing this kind of round robin league table for the managers, the frontline executives were then getting a consistent, aligned understanding that while I am learning on my own, my manager is also offline repeating some of the same messages. And to your point, Edmund, that helps to not just showcase, but also then promote the effectiveness of the learning initiative. And as a result of that, the company was also able to conduct a confidence survey with the same 500 odd people thereafter, and see very clearly, was there an improvement in the person and the manager's confidence of talking about health insurance products to intermediaries as well as customers. So what would be useful to also understand, Edmund, is, what are the other moving parts and how do they sort of work synergistically? You've sort of talked about those 4 key points of view right now. What else is there that you've seen in China working well, and also what has not worked well?
I think what works well is how people are placing online and offline together as total learning solutions for their learners. What doesn't work well is have everything completely online or just do everything offline. I don't think that is the right approach at the moment. It's more on the blended learning approach. As you were saying, in China, previously we was talking about O2O is like from offline to online, but now we are talking OMO, which is offline merging online. So that is the more successful learning solutions that we have come across and see as well.
Right. And I think that's interesting to segue into the second last section of this webinar, which is around, what are certain risks and pitfalls that one needs to keep in mind. And I'll have you also talk about them shortly, Edmund. So, and I think, like what you've said, a lot of companies here in India ultimately aim to start with a very big objective, but when it comes to taking the first step of mobile learning, it's usually with a small group of people relative to the workforce that they have. But I think one thing which we've also seen from experience is, while companies have and rightly so have an ambitious list of objectives to meet, I think even if you are able to be clear with stakeholders that about 70% of those objectives would be met, that by default is a good yardstick to have when you're thinking about whether the initiative was successful or not. I think to what Edmund also said, having a very clear engagement strategy is going to be very important, because learning whether it's engaging enough on mobile is not going to be complete if it's not also backed by certain repetitive messaging which is happening offline. That doesn't necessarily need to only be through an offline training program. It can be as effective as just making sure that managers are taking 2 minutes on a regular basis to indoctrinate the same learning objectives or the same learning content during their meetings or reviews. So that, I think, is a very important perspective to have, of how do you engage with not just the learners offline, but also how do you have other stakeholders with whom this entire initiative can have a value proposition. And on that value proposition point, the third thing we've seen working best with managers, to nobody's surprise really, is linking those activities that you're expecting a manager to do with certain business outcomes as well. And we'll talk about a very specific case, again, with the life insurance company, and how that specific case led to a shortened time in onboarding, lesser attrition, and also higher business productivity. One of the things that we like to also talk about with mobile learning is not to underestimate the importance of the data that you can effectively track. This is a very simple example of a very important module that most salespeople grapple with, which is around answering objections. And as you can see, using a data-driven approach, this company was able to break down objection handling into 6 different concepts or learning tags within answering objection. And in doing so, they were able to track for each of the regions, where was this a gap for a particular region, and more specifically, where was a particular concept not being understood even by an end learner. And by focusing on this, what Edmund is also saying is blended learning, or online merging with offline, can help managers and even trainers make very specific training interventions that are, one, targeted where the content is still a gap, and second, also targeted where there is a gap for a specific region. So this kind of data analysis is very helpful in making sure that mobile learning integrates with existing training practices that a company is already running. And to just conclude, this is the example I'd like to just showcase, wherein you can see for one particular learner over the course of 4 days, by repeatedly taking and being engaged with a certain learning outcome, she was able to improve the understanding of 3 important concepts, which were terms of life insurance, how do you sell life insurance, and the life insurance industry in India. What was very interesting to share with the manager was the last point on the bottom right, where we were able to say that probabilistically, if the person is able to improve her understanding of how to sell life insurance as a concept, it is going to have a 40% impact or increase the likelihood of selling more policies by 40%. Now, this is the kind of communication by default a manager is more attuned to listening to, rather than hearing noise only about, this is an initiative that you need to drive your person to complete. Because this is the kind of thing that a manager will be open to then taking 2 minutes of his or her time in a day and talk to the learner about, so that she can actually understand how to sell life insurance better, and to Edmund's point, then actually create business impact. Edmund, any points over here that you'd like to mention on, what are certain pitfalls that companies in China have taken, which you would advise us to avoid? Number one. And the second question is, what has been your experience with companies in terms of driving business impact through mobile learning? Could you talk about these 2 things?
Yes, I think the first questions that you asked, what's the pitfalls? Very often, our clients will have too much of a high hopes, or they've set very high expectations, especially with the first launch of the mobile learning. As I was saying, I believe there's a saying that aim small, miss small. So what I've told our client to say that, if your learners are not ready, are not 100% ready for mobile learning because they were still used to offline training habits, then take a small team of people, just try it out. And once you get a good reputations, and once you get a successful case study, then you get to launch to the whole company. And that would be more easy to convince our top CEO to invest further, and then to have more resources on that as well. So that is the really on the main thing that we need to avoid. Don't go big right in the beginning. Start something small, and once you get the success, then I think that will build up the approach onto that one.
Right, and would you like to just also give some perspective on what has been your experience vis-a-vis creating business impact for clients in China, and how have Chinese companies been able to successfully create some impact?
Yes, do you want me to talk about my case or just in general?
Well, no, I think a specific case which you have in mind would be really helpful.
Yes, well, I think the vast majority of our clients have asked, would this kind of mobile learning really help us improve our revenues? My answer to them is yes. However, what we would require is the monitoring, the follow-up from the direct supervisor of the learners. Because in China, if learning gyms, we have conducted many training for the sales representative, for the frontline salespeople in different industry. Very often that we're able to provide, I would say, I'm quite proud to say that, perfect selling program to our learners. But what happened next was, once they have learned all that, but they don't actually sustain or transform it into behavior and use it onto the day-to-day work. So what we have done with our clients, saying that it's very essential for their direct supervisors to get involved as well. And it's very interesting. One of our clients actually made the decision of saying that, all right, what we would do in order to prove your points, I'll have one sales team from the north, just doing what I was saying, what I just said. I have the supervisor and the frontline sales people to take the training together. For the next is I only provide sales training for the frontline people in the south. And after 6 months of times, we tracked both the numbers, and by generals, the revenue increased, the effectiveness that they have conducted from the CRM, from the SFE, the Salesforce Effectiveness Programs that they have introduced by 20%. So with the direct involvement of the direct supervisors, that has changed the game dramatically as well, because we have created a common language within the sales team for them, and they're using the same approach to their clients, and that created rhythm. And obviously, after a while, the behavior has changed and the skill sets has been in place, and positive result with review.
Right. Now, I think that's really helpful to understand, and I think this gives us a good framework within which to think about business impact as well. With that, I think we have a few minutes where we could perhaps just take certain questions from the audience as well. I can see that there are quite a few pertinent questions. So, Anandi, if I could request you to just call out the question and maybe from whom it's asked, both Edmund and I would be happy to answer it in the next 5 minutes that we have.
Sure, Karthik. So the first question that we'd be addressing was asked by Meenal, and she's asking if mobile learning can only be used in the form of an addition to classroom training rather than using it as a primary platform for learning.
Right. Edmund, would you like to take that question head on?
Yes, it's very interesting. This question has been asked to us as well. What we tend to do is, for the mobile learning, is we tend to have the conceptual concepts or the key learning message that generally being taught in the classroom trainings transform onto online. And once they get the concept or the key message online, then what we would do offline is actually use role play or some other applications wise of testing, that we might have some board games or other things to test out if they truly understand what the concept being told to them. Because online is just a knowledge transfer. They understand what asking questions, what's open questions, what is open-ended questions means. But in real life, we'll use offline approach to test their knowledge, whether have they applied correctly in that sense. So to answer the questions, yes, we would use this as a primary technologies to stream out all the content to clients, to our learners. But secondly, we'll use offline approach to test the result of it.
Right. I think thanks, Edmund. I think that's a very important question. And just to add to one quick point on what Edmund said, I think it's also contextual to what is at what level are you wanting to impart the training, and or rather with what objective is that training happening. So, for example, with banks, we've seen if it's product knowledge, a lot of product knowledge objectives are largely to do with knowledge transfer, like Edmund was talking about. And for that, online learning and mobile learning is a great use case. But when it comes to then how do you position that product, how do you create a differentiation, how do you sell? Again, the point that Edmund mentioned is absolutely valid in our experience with companies as well, which is a blended approach works very well. And what you can use mobile learning effectively is to redesign your course structure so that 80% of time you're spending on role plays or anything where you're talking about the behavioral nuances, which are harder or rather easier for a learner to understand in person. But then mobile learning can be a great pre and post to see if the data then is also substantiating what did I know before, what do I know now. And one of the things that we are also doing is bridging the gap between the application of learning, which can happen very well in a role play, but how do you also do that in a scalable manner through mobile? That is the next level of let's just say, development that companies and providers like us are also focusing on. So thanks for the question, Meena.
Right.
Anandi, I think we have time for
Karthik
one
and
question.
Edmund. Yes, so we'll just take up another question that we've received from Alicius, who's saying that if the entirety of the training content is for about 120 minutes, how would it be possible to break it into 3 to 5 minute modules? And will the connection be lost then if that happens?
I believe this question is for me.
Yes, Edmund, carry on.
Yes, that's correct. Very often, our client have asked us to break down the content into different bite size. What we would do is we will take into considerations of how this 120 minutes of contents, what sort of context is about. Sometimes we might break it into 6 different modules, or if it's possible, we'll break it into furthermore. What we would take the approach is having said that we will have this 120 minutes using 21 days of times to introduce that of a learning every day throughout the 21 days. And what we want to do, hope to gain in the end, is after 21 days, he or she will be able to get the concept of this 120 minutes and put into actions. So it really depends on what the context or what's the elements within the 120 minutes. Then we will help our clients to break down the contents into different modules.
Yeah, and in fact, I'll just also share an example here. We had a recent client where a half-day workshop was effectively being asked to completely be divested or moved to online mobile-led learning. And depending on how in-depth you want that content to be, in this case, based on what the client's requirements were, we actually created, I think, close to 5 unique modules from that half-day intervention. But otherwise, if it helps, one formulaic approach we've taken, which doesn't always apply because, like Edmund said, it's contextual. But the formula essentially is that if it's a 2-day program, you can effectively break it down into anywhere between 6 to 7 micro-learning modules, where each module should not have more than 20 minutes of learning duration. Now, your point is absolutely right. Won't that create a loss of connection between what you could learn in 2 days versus what you may get in those modules? The answer is absolutely there could be. But the way to think about micro-learning is also to say, what is that 20% of content that's going to solve 80% of the application of learning for the learner? So if I'm talking about product training or sales training or even customer service, let's say complaint handling, there could be a certain set of questions that clients repeatedly ask from your customer service executives, which will form the bulk of that content. And that's what you need to then focus on, rather than necessarily all the peripheral things which you may actually cover in a training program. But I think it's a very valid and very practical question. There is no formulaic answer beyond what I said. That's also just a framework. And a lot of times that framework may not be valid, especially given what the context is.
I would like to add that for these, because very often clients would like to break down their contents into bite size. What we have done is we also create a learning journey for them. As I was saying, that we use the 4 key elements: the promotions, learning, activity, and the showcase, in order to keep the connections close within. And the reason why we have taken, in China, we've taken a 21-day approach is that's how long it would take a person and individuals to change their behavior into. So that's just the approach, because we have limited time today and I wouldn't be able to explain a little bit more in details, but that's just the case that we're using in China here.
Right, thanks for mentioning that, Edmund. I think with that, unfortunately, I think we've shot the time also by about 10 minutes. So unfortunately, we will have to wrap. I can see there are still a few questions which certain people have asked. So firstly, thank you very much for asking them. We would be sure to come back to you with an answer, perhaps on email later during the course of today or tomorrow. But if I can, I'd like to thank all of you again for taking out the time to hear both Edmund and whatever we had to share. Hopefully this was helpful to understand from another country's perspective as well, and help you frame what your mobile strategy needs to be. Edmund, I'd like you also again for taking the time to join us as our partner for this webinar. And we look forward to having a future webinar with you and with all of you in the audience again soon. Thank you, Anandi. Over to you.
Thank you, Karthik. So as for all the participants, thank you for being a part of this. And I hope that this was a fruitful session for all of you. As we had discussed earlier before the beginning of the webinar, all of you will be receiving a recorded version of it via email. And if anyone wants the presentation, a copy of it, please write to us at info@inspireone.in, and we'd be happy to share the presentation with you. Edmund and Karthik, thank you so much for conducting this very interesting session and giving us a broader perspective of mobile learning in India and China. Thank you. Cancel.